Story 1. The Bedtime Battle, Victorian Insomnia Cures and the Rise of Sleep Hygiene. You are living in the heart of Victorian London. The streets are teeming with horse-drawn carriages, soot-blackened chimneys, and the echo of boots on cobblestone. The empire never sleeps, or at least it doesn't sleep well. It's 1884 and the British Empire spans continents. Steam, soot, and gaslight keep cities humming late into the night. And for the first time in human history, the night is no longer dark. Sleep is no longer sacred. In fact, it has become a problem. Insomnia wasn't always a medical concern, but during the Victorian era it became a whispered epidemic. Writers, clerks, nurses, aristocrats, and factory workers alike reported it, lying awake into the small hours, caught between exhaustion and anxiety. Doctors, spiritualists, inventors, and entrepreneurs rushed in with solutions, some harmless, many harmful. This is the story of how a world newly lit by gaslight and stirred by industrial rhythm began to lose its oldest friend: restful, uninterrupted sleep. Gaslight and the problem of perpetual day. Before gaslighting became a metaphor, it was a literal transformation of the urban night. Beginning in the early 1800s, British cities introduced public gas lamps. By the 1840s, most middle-class homes had indoor gas lighting. Suddenly, it was possible to read at midnight, dine at 10, or walk through central London in near daylight. This new illumination created opportunities and pressures. Office workers now had longer hours. Writers and clerks could be productive after sunset. Shopkeepers extended business hours. Even social gatherings shifted later into the night. Night was no longer for rest alone. In this world of artificial brightness, many found it hard to power down. The medicalization of sleeplessness. Victorian doctors began documenting a rise in sleeplessness. Insomnia was described in alarming tones, sometimes as a moral failing, other times as a symptom of modernity's toll on the nervous system. In 1853, physician William W. Gull noted that wakefulness of mind was becoming common among the industrious classes. What caused it? The list was long: improper digestion, late meals, sedentary habits, emotional overexcitement, overeating, or even nocturnal thoughts. Men were urged to avoid stimulating conversation in the evening. Women were discouraged from reading novels after tea. Medical professionals began issuing sleep prescriptions. These included things like avoidance of stimulating food, like tomatoes and spicy meat. No reading before bed. Gentle exercise like indoor calisthenics. Ventilation of the bedroom, to allow in night air. A warm foot bath at precisely 9:00 p.m. Insomnia became one of the era's most chronic and quietly suffered afflictions, especially among the educated and urban classes. It was treated not only as a personal inconvenience, but as a threat to moral and societal order. Enter the sleep entrepreneurs. Alongside medical professionals came a wave of inventors, quacks, and entrepreneurs who saw in insomnia a lucrative opportunity. The slumber chair, the patent nervous pacifier, the soporific pillow, and hundreds of tinctures and herbal compounds appeared in apothecaries and catalogs. Many of these relied on ingredients we now consider dangerous. Laudanum, tincture of opium, widely prescribed and available over the counter. Chloral hydrate, a sedative introduced in the 1870s, known to be addictive. Ether and chloroform, sometimes inhaled at bedtime, often with little guidance. Herbal elixirs, including everything from hops and valerian to cannabis indica. The Victorian sleep aid market was both booming and unregulated. Adverts in the Lancet and the Illustrated London News promised cures for the insufferable agony of nightly wakefulness. Women were targeted heavily. Sleeplessness was seen as a sign of delicate female nerves. The gendered nature of sleeplessness. Victorian gender roles shaped the understanding and treatment of insomnia. Women were perceived as more emotionally and physically fragile. Doctors often linked their sleeplessness to hysteria, menstruation, or the responsibilities of motherhood. They were advised to take warm milk, avoid unladylike worries, and recline in lavender-scented rooms. Men, on the other hand, were seen as suffering from insomnia due to ambition, business anxiety, or overwork. They were given stronger tonics and even early electrotherapy treatments. It wasn't uncommon for women to be prescribed bed rest for sleeplessness, a paradoxical solution, considering that excessive time in bed often worsened the condition. The bed becomes a battleground. To understand the era's obsession with sleep, we must understand how the Victorians viewed the bed itself. It wasn't merely a place to rest. It was a site of control. Beds were often made of hard wood or iron. The mattress was usually horsehair or straw. Featherbeds, once popular, were deemed unhygienic. Doctors advised patients to sleep on firm, narrow mattresses, often with the window open, even in winter. The idea was that too much comfort could weaken the body or lull one into unhealthy sloth. Even the pillow height was debated. Some doctors insisted on a single flat pillow, others recommended two thick ones to assist digestion. Sheets had to be tucked with military precision. Beds were not meant to embrace you, they were meant to discipline you. Sleep had become a moral act. The rise of the sleep diary. For the most anxious of the sleepless, doctors began recommending a new tool, the sleep diary. Patients were to record the time they went to bed, the time they awoke, any dreams remembered, times awakened in the night, food consumed within 6 hours of bedtime, emotional events of the day. This data was analyzed to identify sleep sins. Perhaps you had an argument after dinner, or read a poem too stimulating for the nerves, or failed to take your bitters. The Victorian sleep diary is an early ancestor of the sleep tracking apps we know today, though it required, ironically, quite a lot of time spent awake, writing about sleep. A culture of night watchers. Despite all efforts, many Victorians never did sleep through the night. Segmented sleep, in which individuals would sleep in two parts, first sleep and second sleep, with an hour or two of wakefulness in between, was still practiced, though doctors began to pathologize it. That in-between time, once used for quiet prayer or thought, now became a source of anxiety. What were you doing awake at 2:00 a.m.? The fear of sleeplessness, for many, was worse than the reality of it. It was tied to morality, health, and class. But could it be that sleeplessness wasn't just a modern plague? Could it be that the Victorian world was trying to cure something that wasn't, in fact, broken? A culture obsessed with control. As the Victorian era marched forward, the obsession with discipline extended into all realms of life work, cleanliness, etiquette, diet, and sleep. Sleep was no longer something that simply happened. It had to be managed, tracked, and controlled. In fact, the less it cooperated, the more attention it demanded. Enter the physician as night manager. By the 1870s and 1880s, medical journals began publishing lengthy treatises on insomnia, not simply as a passing complaint, but as a condition of deep physiological importance. A sleepless mind was thought to teeter dangerously close to insanity. Doctors feared that chronic insomnia could tip a person into nervous breakdown, hallucination, or madness. For the respectable middle and upper classes, that possibility was terrifying. They weren't wrong to worry. The connection between sleep and mental health was beginning to emerge, though still deeply misunderstood. Some medical thinkers began drawing comparisons between dream states, psychosis, and sleep deprivation, but the tools to measure brain function were still decades away. What the Victorians had instead were anecdotes, assumptions, and an ever-expanding cabinet of solutions. The sleep lectures and public education. Public lectures on insomnia became common in larger cities. Medical men, and they were almost exclusively men, would give lectures in town halls, libraries, and church basements titled things like On the Management of the Nervous Patient, The Restorative Function of Sleep, Hygienic Bedchambers, and the Rational Mind. These events were often well attended, especially by the middle class. Some brought notebooks, others brought questions. A few brought their ailments in vivid detail, hoping for an impromptu diagnosis. The advice was often prescriptive and moralistic. No thoughts of commerce after dusk. Avoid reading by gaslight for more than 1 hour. Cease consumption of preserved meats, pickles, and fiery spirits. In essence, to sleep well was to live properly. The bedchamber as a therapeutic environment. With sleep being redefined as a health issue, the bedroom itself took on new meaning. Interior design began to shift. Gone were the heavily upholstered, dark-toned, velvet-draped sleeping quarters of the early 19th century. In came lighter colors, minimalist furnishings, and breathable fabrics. Medical experts advised eliminating thick curtains, removing gas lamps at bedtime, and even using pale wallpaper colors to promote calm. Some home guides recommended positioning the bed so that the sleeper's head faced magnetic north, a theory imported from German naturalists. Windows were to remain open, regardless of season. The inflow of fresh air was considered more important than comfort. Patients were told to sleep beneath thick wool while the icy wind crept in through cracked panes. To the modern listener, this may seem almost ascetic, but for the Victorians, comfort was not always the goal moral hygiene was. Case studies from the Insomnia files. Let's take a moment to examine 2 real cases drawn from 19th century medical journals and memoirs, illustrating both the depth of concern and the sometimes bizarre lengths to which patients and physicians went. Case 1. The Industrious Clerk. Mr. W.C., a 32-year-old clerk in London, reported to Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell that he had not slept soundly in 4 years. He worked 10 hours daily, kept meticulous financial records, and had an aversion to social distraction. Dr. Mitchell's prescription: daily horseback riding at 4 p.m., ceasing all ledger work after 6 p.m., cold bath upon waking, no writing after sunset. Mr. W.C. followed the regimen precisely and claimed partial improvement, but continued to report vivid, intrusive dreams, often involving rows of numbers marching across black space. Even dreams, it seemed, had become bureaucratic. Case 2. The Overeducated Governess. Miss E.R., aged 41, worked as a governess for a wealthy family in Edinburgh. Her sleeplessness began gradually, first once a week, then every night. She described it as a buzzing of the brain and a paralyzing heaviness of limb. The attending physician believed she had absorbed too many books and too few walks. His prescription: no reading after 3 p.m., 3 walks daily, each exceeding 20 minutes, a spoon of malt extract before bed, light conversation with a child before retiring. Her condition did improve, but her story was recorded with a warning that solitary intellectual exertion in women was an underappreciated hazard. The dream theories of the A. The Victorian period also brought renewed interest in dreams, not for their prophetic content, but for what they revealed about the mind. German and French psychologists, including the likes of Wilhelm Wundt and Jean-Martin Charcot, were beginning to explore the unconscious. Dreams were now data. Nightmares were no longer omens but signs of internal conflict, unresolved moral dilemmas, or digestion gone awry. The British were slower to adopt these continental theories, but still, the idea that dreams could inform diagnosis began to seep into medical practice. Some physicians asked patients to describe their dreams in detail. Were they of movement or stillness, of people or places? Were they agitated or restful, recurring or nonsensical? Patients, meanwhile, were often hesitant to reveal too much. For to dream of sensuality, violence, or fear was to confess an inner imperfection. The unconscious, after all, had not yet been normalized. It was suspect. Religion and sleep. While doctors promoted physiology and habit, religion had not entirely left the conversation. Many Victorians believed insomnia had spiritual causes: pride, guilt, vanity, or the refusal to surrender to God's will. Clergymen advised their flocks to pray before sleep, to confess worries, and to remember that God giveth his beloved sleep. Psalm 127:2. This passage was frequently embroidered on pillows or quoted in diaries. One curious practice involved writing prayers in the middle of the night during wakeful hours, to convert that time into holy labor. Others kept small Bibles by the bedside for such interruptions. Thus, sleeplessness was not always seen as a curse. For some, it became a space for quiet spirituality, a night vigil, rather than a restless failure. A rising market for quiet. By the end of the century, an entire industry had emerged around quiet, not just the absence of noise, but the cultivation of it. Books promised silent homes and quiet nerves. Curtain manufacturers boasted of materials that muffled carriage wheels. Inventors marketed sound-absorbing bedroom furniture. The idea of noise pollution had not yet arrived, but the craving for silence was beginning. Some hotels advertised soundless rooms for business travelers and the nervous. Others offered pure air sleeping floors, with open windows facing gardens and no gas lines. The wealthy elite could afford such silence. For the working class, noisy tenements and overcrowded rooms were inescapable. Their insomnia was chalked up to moral weakness, not environment. The great irony of Victorian sleep culture. Perhaps the most curious irony of all was this. In trying so hard to control sleep, Victorians may have lost it altogether. By pathologizing every aspect of rest: posture, diet, dream content, moral state, they created a culture of hyperattention. And nothing is more hostile to sleep than excessive self-monitoring. For all the gadgets, elixirs, and advice, many Victorian sleepers were left precisely where they started, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the peace that never came. And yet the question remained. Was it sleeplessness that afflicted them, or the fear of sleeplessness itself? The sleep industry becomes institutional. By the final decades of the 19th century, the Victorian obsession with sleeplessness had matured into something larger and more entrenched: a system. What began as personal discomfort and private complaint evolved into a network of medical literature, consumer goods, pharmaceutical innovation, and cultural anxiety. This was no longer a matter of just being tired. Medical schools introduced lectures on sleep regulation. Hospitals recorded patients' sleep patterns as part of broader diagnostic profiles. Sleep was tied to national productivity, to health, to gender, and in many ways to class. For the well-off, it became a lifestyle concern. For the working poor, it remained a sign of misfortune or moral decay. And in the center of it all, the elusive promise of a full night's rest. The scientific turn, from guesswork to physiology. In the 1890s, the study of sleep began inching away from moral theory and toward measurable biology. Medical researchers like Dr. Edward Schaefer at University College London conducted early experiments on nervous excitation and sedative effects. Electroencephalography, EEG, wouldn't exist for another 30 years, but physicians were slowly beginning to understand that the brain operated in rhythms. They studied heart rates, breathing patterns, and body temperatures during different phases of sleep. Insomnia was redefined from a spiritual affliction or nervous indulgence to something physiological, an imbalance of systems. This shift had profound consequences. It legitimized sleep research within medical science. It allowed physicians to prescribe with more precision. It gradually destigmatized sleeplessness, particularly among men. It opened the door to an entirely new industry, modern pharmaceuticals, the business of sleep. While medical science inched forward, the business world sprinted. Between 1880 and 1910, Britain saw an explosion of sleep-related products: sleep mattresses, infusions, head-cooling devices, noise-canceling panels, and dozens of competing night drafts, liquid sedatives. Many of these were advertised in women's magazines and medical gazettes. A few key entries. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup contained morphine and was marketed for bobbies and adults alike. It quieted the nerves but led to many deaths. Godfrey's cordial, an opiate-based solution originally for infants but repurposed for adult use. Hypnol and Dormiol, early pharmaceutical sedatives that preceded barbiturates. These cures worked at first, but they often brought addiction, tolerance, or worse. The boundary between sleep aid and narcotic blurred dangerously. The Victorian faith in science sometimes outpaced the science itself. The colonial sleep narrative. It's worth noting that Victorian concerns about sleep extended beyond Britain. As the empire expanded, British colonists attempted to export sleep norms insisting upon strict bedtimes, quiet hours, and firm sleep routines in climates and cultures that did not share the same rhythms. Missionaries in India and East Africa reported frustration at locals who napped in the afternoon or rose before dawn to conduct business. Colonial officers described the tropical midday rest, siesta, as indulgent or uncivilized. Here, sleep became a vehicle for cultural control, another domain in which empire sought uniformity. Just as the British exported clocks, they attempted to export the notion of proper sleep. This would not be the last time Western sleep norms were imposed globally. The domestic fallout, women and the burden of perfect sleep. Despite advances in science, the cultural expectations around women and sleep persisted. By 1900, sleeplessness in women was no longer seen merely as a hysteria, it was increasingly diagnosed as neurasthenia, a vague but serious-sounding condition marked by exhaustion, weakness, and irritability. The solution: isolation, bed rest, silence, nutritional tonics. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's famous 1892 story, The Yellow Wallpaper, was based on her real experience with such treatment. It portrayed a woman slowly descending into madness under the weight of enforced inactivity, including forced rest and monitored sleep. The Victorian sleep cure, especially for women, could become its own kind of prison. The final prescription: boredom as medicine. Curiously, by the early 1900s, a new recommendation for insomnia began to appear in both medical texts and public advice columns: intentional boredom. Patients were advised to read dull texts, often legal documents or classical Latin grammar. Listen to sermons or speeches. Repeat phrases like "I am sleepy" aloud until drowsiness emerged. Lie still and count to 1,000 without skipping any numbers. One medical advisor even suggested slowly reciting British monarchs in reverse order. The logic was this: a mind that stops chasing sleep is more likely to find it. This strategy was far from new. Medieval monks used similar techniques during evening vigils. But in the industrial age, boredom had a new meaning. It wasn't just a state, it was a tool, a mild sedation of the conscious mind. And it marked a shift away from stimulation toward surrender. To sleep, perhaps, one needed to bore oneself into it. The legacy of Victorian sleep culture. What did the Victorians leave behind in our modern conception of sleep? Quite a lot, it turns out. The idea that sleep should be continuous and silent. The assumption that 8 hours is ideal for all. The belief that insomnia is a personal failing rather than a complex, multifactorial condition. the commercial sleep industry from calming teas to white noise machines. Sleep hygiene principles, dark, cool rooms, bedtime routines, no stimulation before bed. And perhaps most importantly, they left us a question. Is our rest shaped more by biology or by culture? The Victorians, in their earnest attempts to master sleep, may have inadvertently created the modern insomnia paradox, a society that thinks about sleep constantly, but achieves it uneasily. Closing reflection. As you lay in bed tonight, consider this. Your worries about not sleeping have a history. They've been cataloged, moralized, monetized, and treated for centuries. The routines we follow, the herbal teas, the silent rooms, the bedtime rules, they echo the lives of those who once believed that even rest must be earned. And still, despite all efforts, sleep remains as mysterious and uncontrollable as ever. Perhaps that is its power. Story 2. The Postmaster's Dilemma. Sleep and shift work in the 19th century mail system. A network of sleepless threads. Imagine the sound of hoofbeats echoing in the dead of night, wheels rattling over rough stone roads, and the faint glimmer of a lantern swaying from a galloping coach. It's 1852, and somewhere between York and London, a mail carriage cuts through the darkness, one of hundreds threading their way across Britain in the pre-dawn hours. Few people think of the postal system as a test of human endurance, but in the 19th century, mail delivery was one of the most sleep-deprived occupations in the world. This is the story of how the night mail defined not only communication, but also reshaped labor, sleep patterns, and the very notion of time. In the early 1800s, the postal system was one of the first institutions to require continuous, round-the-clock operation. This meant long shifts, night work, irregular rest, and a workforce caught between the ticking of the clock and the heaviness of their eyelids. The Royal Mail Coach, an early machine of sleep deprivation. The Royal Mail Coach system was introduced in 1784 and expanded rapidly across Britain. These coaches, fast, horse-drawn, and strictly scheduled, became the arteries of British communication. They were expected to run day and night, with stops only for fresh horses or to change drivers. Each coach carried one mail guard, responsible for the security of the bags, one or more drivers, sometimes switching en route, occasionally paying passengers, who endured the journey with limited space and fewer comforts than a prison cell. The mail guards were among the most sleep-deprived men in the country. Armed with pistols and a brass horn, they had to remain awake through the darkest hours, often exposed to cold rain, fog, or snow. They were held to strict punctuality. Delays were punishable. There were no beds, no breaks, and very little compassion. Sleeping on the job, a dangerous offense. Records from the General Post Office, GPO, show that falling asleep on the job was a sackable offense, sometimes even resulting in legal penalties if mail was delayed or lost. Guards or postboys caught dozing at inns, stables, or sorting rooms could face dismissal. A letter from 1837 reads, "It has come to the postmaster's attention that Mr. F.G. was observed in a slumbering condition, while the mails were yet unsorted at 3:15 in the morning. Let it be known, this dereliction of duty shall not be tolerated." Some postmasters, themselves no strangers to exhaustion, implemented rotating shifts or standing desks to discourage sleep. But others believed fatigue was a matter of willpower, evidence of a weak constitution or moral failing. To be tired was to be inefficient. To sleep was often to sin. The sorting offices, chaos in the night. While the coaches thundered through the countryside, mail sorting stations in cities like London, Edinburgh, and Manchester operated through the night. Hundreds of clerks stood at high wooden desks, tossing letters into narrow slots, often working 12-hour shifts in dim light. The sorting process demanded high precision. A misrouted letter could delay critical communications for days. As volume increased, especially after the introduction of the penny post in 1840, so too did the pressure. To stay awake, clerks relied on strong tea. Coffee was less common in Britain at the time. Tobacco, chewing cloves or mustard seeds, dousing their faces in cold water, reciting the alphabet aloud, slapping their cheeks to remain alert. Many developed what today we'd call shift work disorder, insomnia, anxiety, memory lapses, and social withdrawal. At the time, it was simply the postman's weariness. The science of time comes calling. The rise of night mail coincided with a new scientific obsession, chronometry, the precise measurement of time. As trains began to replace mail coaches, timetables became even more rigid. The synchronization of time across cities was necessary to prevent railway accidents and ensure mail arrived precisely when expected. The result, a complete restructuring of how people thought about day and night. Time was no longer local, it was standardized. Greenwich Mean Time became a national fixture in 1847. Postmasters, once local officials, now had to operate according to a unified clock. This meant overnight workers were tethered to rhythms that no longer matched their own bodies or the world around them. Even the stars were ignored. The clock had one. A glimpse inside the GPO. Let us pause and picture the General Post Office of London around 1860. Inside the cavernous building on St. Martin's-le-Grand, long wooden counters stretched the length of the hall. Flickering gaslights cast long shadows across stacks of letters, wax-sealed parcels, and time-stamped pigeonholes. Clerks in waistcoats and heavy coats work in near silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of envelopes or the dull thud of a sorting tray. Some squint through pince-nez spectacles. Others mutter towns and counties to themselves like mantras. There are no windows, no fresh air, only paper, ink, and the insistent weight of obligation. The postmaster stands above on a small raised platform, checking timepieces against the official wall clock. Every quarter hour, he marks a register. No one is sleeping, not yet. Letters from the front lines of fatigue. Among the most revealing documents of this period are the anonymous letters and diary entries from postal workers themselves. Most did not write for publication. They scribbled in the margins of ledgers, in personal journals, or in letters never meant for delivery. One from 1854 reads, "The hands shake after 2 o'clock. I do see the names slip off the page. Sometimes I sort a whole bag before I realize I've placed half the letters in the wrong boxes." Another, "The boys in the west corner take turns napping behind the crates. It's unspoken. They cover for each other. The master mustn't know." And another, "It is not the work that tires me. It is the silence and the watching of the clock and the knowing I cannot rest." These fragments reveal the emotional texture of sleep deprivation, not just the bodily fatigue, but the erosion of clarity, dignity, and joy. The unseen cost of connectivity. For all its efficiency, the Victorian postal system extracted an invisible toll, a national sleep debt carried on the shoulders of those who kept the country connected. The ability to receive a letter by morning, even if posted at midnight, was hailed as a triumph of civilization. But few asked what price was paid by the hands that moved it through the night. Did society need such speed? Or had the machinery of communication outpaced the needs of rest? By 1880, some reformers were beginning to ask such questions. Experiments with rotating shifts and rest hours began to appear in some cities. Still, the pace only quickened with the arrival of telegraphs and electric lighting. Sleep, especially for shift workers, would never return to what it once was. An open question at the turn of the century. As the Victorian age drew to a close, the Royal Mail stood as one of the most admired institutions in Britain. It was fast, efficient, and reliable, but it was built on the sleepless backs of men and boys who worked while the rest of the nation slumbered. This raises a curious thought. Was the true marvel of the Victorian mail system its speed, or its human endurance? The telegraph arrives and sleep slips further away. By the 1850s and 1860s, another revolution began changing the fabric of the postal system, and with it, the sleep cycles of those who worked within it. The electric telegraph. First dismissed by some postmasters as a novelty, the telegraph quickly became indispensable. Messages that once took days could now be transmitted in minutes. The Royal Mail adapted rapidly, building telegraph rooms adjacent to sorting halls. Clerks were retrained. Overnight staff grew. And so a curious thing happened. Just as horses and coaches had reshaped 18th century time, the telegraph unhinged it entirely. Information no longer needed a body to carry it, but someone still had to send it, receive it, and transcribe it at any hour of day or night. Suddenly, even the concept of time zones became inconvenient. What time was it in Glasgow when you sent a telegram from London at 10:13 p.m.? And when would it be read? The result: workers in telegraph offices began operating 24/7, especially in major cities. Shift rotations became more aggressive, sleep more fragmented, and the line between night and day blurred beyond recognition. The lives of night telegraphists. Night telegraph operators, often young men barely in their 20s, worked alone or in pairs, seated beside ticking relay machines and coils of wire. Most telegraph rooms were unheated, poorly lit, and suffused with the metallic smell of cables and ink. Their tasks required intense concentration, translating Morse code into legible English by hand, then rushing the transcribed message to the appropriate department or preparing it for local delivery. Fatigue wasn't just an inconvenience, it was dangerous. One missed dash or dot, one reversed number, and the message could be rendered meaningless, or worse, misinterpreted. A report from 1871 details a case in which a fatigued clerk wrote "died" instead of "delayed" in a message to a shipping company. The result: panic, cancellations, and lawsuits. To stay alert, operators developed rituals. Packing between transmissions. Keeping one shoe off to avoid falling asleep while seated. Clenching a pencil between the teeth. Eating dry crackers loud and slow to chew. Many grew accustomed to polyphasic sleep, taking multiple short naps during the day to prepare for a single long night. Sorting sleep in the age of steel. By the 1870s, railways had replaced most Royal Mail coaches, and the sorting of letters no longer happened only in city offices. Instead, specialized mail trains fitted with sorting compartments allowed clerks to process mail while in motion. This innovation sped up delivery, but for the men inside those cramped, swaying rail cars, the work became more demanding. Traveling post office, TPO clerks had to stand upright as the train swayed and clattered, sort hundreds of letters an hour into narrow pigeonholes, catch and throw mailbags using hooks while moving past rural stations, sleep when possible on small wooden benches, often with mailbags for pillows. Sleep on the TPO was never restful. It came in short bursts between stops, filled with noise and movement. The combination of physical labor and mental focus made the position one of the most grueling in the postal service. One retired clerk recalled, "I learned to sleep with one eye open and my legs braced at a diagonal. You couldn't let go even in your dreams. You were still sorting." Sleep strategies of the postal underground. Behind the scenes, night shift postal workers developed informal systems of survival. These weren't published in manuals or approved by supervisors, they were passed along by word of mouth. Among these were the ladder nap, a brief 7-minute rest with one's back against a sorting ladder. The angle prevented full sleep but allowed the legs and spine to relax. The half-tray pillow, turning a mail sorting tray upside down on a desk, resting the arms atop it with the forehead pressed down, allowing a kind of standing sleep. The ghost shift, where two clerks unofficially alternated micronaps. One kept the trays active while the other slipped behind the sorting racks for a few minutes of rest. Most supervisors knew, few intervened. The system needed to function and workers needed to survive. It was a delicate, silent agreement. The postmaster's dilemma: compassion versus clock. Postmasters, those charged with overseeing local or regional postal operations, found themselves in an impossible position. On the one hand, they were the enforcers of time, accuracy, and discipline. They maintained the schedules, answered to Parliament, and ensured that the post arrived on time. On the other hand, they were human. Many had come up through the ranks. They remembered the pain of sore eyes at 3 a.m., the taste of tepid tea, the blur of black ink under gaslight. Records show many postmasters unofficially sanctioned rest breaks, especially after 2 a.m., or gave older clerks easier assignments. Some installed benches in sorting rooms or created rotating sleep shifts, even before it was formally allowed. But every kindness was a gamble. A missed delivery could lead to censure or removal. It was a constant tug-of-war between compassion and the ticking of the schedule. A public unaware of the sleepless engine. Victorians adored their postal service. It was fast, trustworthy, and inexpensive. The public sent millions of letters annually, love notes, business contracts, invitations, and condolences, all with the belief that they would arrive promptly. But few considered the human machinery behind that magic. To the average citizen, the postman was simply the man who walked the morning route, whistling and tipping his cap. The night shift clerks, sorters, and telegraphists were invisible. And so their sleep or lack thereof never entered public discourse. This invisibility created a strange historical silence. We have dozens of memoirs from postmasters and daytime officials, but very few from night workers. Their fatigue remains largely undocumented, known only through inference and fragment. The slowly shifting culture of sleep. By the end of the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution had transformed human life and reshaped its nights. With gas lamps, electric bulbs, and global communications, sleep was no longer protected by darkness. Shift work became common across many professions: factories, bakeries, telegraphs, hospitals, and the postal service had led the way. It also led to new questions, such as, can a body trained to stay awake at night ever fully recover? Are night workers owed more compensation for the biological strain? Should rest be scheduled by the clock or by the body? These debates would not be resolved in the Victorian era, but they had begun. The price of never being late. As the Royal Mail modernized, with larger sorting hubs, electric lighting, and more telegraph lines, its workers continued to serve through the small hours. Trains got faster. Delivery promises grew more ambitious. But beneath it all lay the same truth. The faster the system, the less sleep for those who kept it running. And so we're left with a haunting question. In making the mail move at all hours, had the Victorians moved faster than their bodies could bear? A tired workforce begins to push back. As the 19th century drew to a close, voices from within the postal system began to grow louder, not in anger, but in quiet, persistent protest. Long hours, sleepless shifts, and rigid expectations were taking their toll, and postal workers, many of whom were literate, observant, and deeply loyal to their service, began writing to newspapers and local officials. Letters to the Times and the Postman's Gazette began appearing with increasing frequency. A man cannot rightly sort letters at 4 in the morning if he has not closed his eyes since 9 the night before. It is not idleness that makes a man slow on the night shift. It is the burden of too many days running together. The earliest forms of postal unionization began to take shape. The Postmen's Federation, founded in 1891, eventually merged with other worker organizations to demand better hours, wages, and conditions. One of their core concerns, reasonable rest. This marked a turning point. For the first time, sleep or the right to it entered the language of labor reform. The first efforts at reform. By the early 1900s, some regional post offices began experimenting with shorter overnight shifts, capped at 6 or 7 hours, rotating night and day cycles, so workers could alternate rest periods, built-in rest breaks, often with small bunkrooms adjacent to sorting halls, access to warm food, where possible even after midnight. These changes were minor, inconsistent, and slow to spread, but they represented a subtle admission: the sleepless model was unsustainable. Some administrators even commissioned internal studies. One 1903 report from Manchester noted that accuracy dropped by 38% after 3 a.m. Another noted increased illnesses and absenteeism among night telegraph staff compared to day staff. The data was primitive, but the conclusions were clear. The long shadows of industrial night. Despite reform efforts, the basic reality of shift work remained. The mail still had to move. The trains still had to run. The sorting halls still had to be staffed. Night shift culture did not vanish, but it began to evolve. Post-war decades would bring new innovations. The invention of fluorescent lighting made night work more palatable. Automated sorting machines reduced the need for human labor, though they did not eliminate it. Labor laws slowly introduced caps on hours, mandating rest periods. Sleep medicine, emerging in the 20th century, began to study shift work more formally. But in many ways, the struggles of the Victorian postal worker set the template for modern shift work, balancing productivity with exhaustion, public service with private cost. The hidden legacy of the night mail. When historians speak of the British Postal Service, they often focus on its efficiency, its global reach, and its innovations in communication. But seldom do they mention its role in shaping labor patterns, sleep culture, and the very concept of the round-the-clock workforce. Before factories adopted 24-hour production, before hospitals ran overnight ERs, before call centers and airports and global trade, there was the night mail. And behind every letter delivered at dawn was a man who had not slept. Sleep and the Machine. In 1899, the writer and social critic H.G. Wells wrote of the modern age. We have made machines of men, and now they must rest when the schedule allows it, not when the body desires. He wasn't speaking directly of the Postal Service, but he could have been. The mail trains that raced through the night, the telegrams that sparked at 2 a.m., the piles of letters sorted by lantern light, they all represented a triumph of human organization. But they also reflected a growing disconnection between nature and schedule, between biology and clockwork. To force the body to serve the machine was a hallmark of modernity, and sleep, once sacred, cyclical, and intuitive, became negotiable. Closing the back. As the last train pulled into the station just before sunrise, and the postman unfolded his delivery pouch, a new day began. Letters were distributed, telegrams received, and the world went on never knowing the price paid by those who worked while it slept. Somewhere in a back office, a telegraphist rubbed his eyes, a sorter leaned against the pigeonholes, a postmaster checked his pocket watch. Another night completed, another bag closed. And one must wonder, in our pursuit of constant communication, what have we lost in the silence of the night? Story 3. A Spoonful of Syrup. The Forgotten Histories of 1800s Patent Medicines. Medicine by the spoonful, sleep by the drop. It is the year 1875. You are in a dimly lit London apothecary. Glass bottles line the shelves, amber, green, and clear. They bear labels in ornate script: Dr. Bateman's pectoral drops, Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, Godfrey's cordial, Dalby's carminative. The room smells of camphor, licorice root, alcohol, and something faintly metallic. You're here because you, or more likely your child, can't sleep. The apothecary, with his spotless apron and clipped mustache, doesn't ask too many questions. He doesn't need to. You are handed a bottle, told to give half a teaspoon at bedtime, and reassured it's entirely safe. You do not know it contains morphine. This was the reality for thousands across Britain, America, and Europe in the 19th century. In the age before pharmaceutical regulation, sleep came in a bottle, often at terrible cost. This is the story of the patent medicine era: how desperate mothers, exhausted workers, and anxious elites turned to chemical comfort, and how sleep, once natural and precious, became packaged, sold, and sometimes poisoned. What were patent medicines? The term patent medicine is something of a misnomer. These products were rarely patented in the legal sense. Doing so would require revealing their ingredients. Instead, patent implied prestige, originality, or royal endorsement. These medicines were proprietary formulas, often mixtures of herbs, alcohol, opiates, sugar, and flavoring, marketed as cure-alls. They promised to relieve nervousness, indigestion, sleeplessness, headaches, teething pain, female troubles, hysteria, melancholy. No prescription was required, no testing was done, advertising was everything. And among the most powerful and popular claims, the ability to induce sleep. The marketing of drowsiness. Sleep aids were not a niche market. They were everywhere in newspapers, pamphlets, billboards, and posters. Medicines were sold in shops, general stores, even by traveling salesmen. Many came in syrup form, sweet, thick, and deceptively pleasant tasting. Consider just a few examples. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. Marketed primarily to mothers with teething infants, this syrup contained morphine sulfate, alcohol, and ammonium carbonate. It promised restful sleep for baby and, by extension, for mother. Its slogan: soothes the child, softens the gums, allays pain, and induces sleep. Millions of bottles were sold across the English-speaking world. It was deadly in large doses, yet its reputation endured for decades, despite the risks. Godfrey's cordial, a mixture of opium and treacle, used to calm children, relieve diarrhea, and help the anxious rest. It was commonly given at bedtime or after meals. Poor families used it liberally, sometimes to lull infants while they worked long shifts in factories. Dalby's carminative, advertised for wind, colic, and sleeplessness in infants. Dalby's mixture contained tincture of opium, a popular ingredient in countless nostrums. To the modern mind, it's alarming, but to the 19th century family, it was routine. Why did people trust these medicines? The 1800s were an age of limited medical access. Professional doctors were expensive, often distant, and not necessarily trusted. Home remedies and over-the-counter treatments were familiar, accessible, and marketed as scientific. Moreover, people had few alternatives. Infant mortality was high. Parents would do anything to ease a child's suffering. Labor conditions were grueling. Adults needed to sleep quickly and deeply between shifts. Mental illness was stigmatized, so nervousness and hysteria were self-treated. Patent medicines offered instant solutions, with no moral judgment attached. They were modern, affordable, and often endorsed by celebrities, clergy, and even royalty, though those endorsements were often exaggerated or fabricated. And for a time, they worked because their ingredients were pharmacologically potent, even if poorly understood. The dark side of the syrup. It didn't take long for problems to emerge. As early as the 1820s, Coroner's reports began to note infant deaths linked to sleeping powders and syrups, but few officials were willing or able to challenge the booming patent medicine trade. Deaths were often blamed on the child's frail constitution or illness. No one wanted to accuse a grieving mother or implicate a respected local apothecary. Even when addiction was observed, particularly among adults, it was usually misdiagnosed as melancholy or moral weakness. By the mid-19th century, entire families were unknowingly dependent on opium-laced sleep tonics. Some symptoms recorded: withdrawal tremors when attempting to stop syrup use, increasing doses required for the same effect, profound daytime drowsiness, mental fog or confusion, especially among women and elderly users, death from overdose, particularly in children under 2. And yet, despite mounting evidence, there were few calls for regulation, at least not yet. The business behind the bottles. By 1860, the British patent medicine industry was a juggernaut. Some manufacturers became incredibly wealthy, exporting their wares to the United States, Canada, Australia, and India. One of the most notorious was Thomas Holloway, whose Holloway's pills and ointments were advertised as cures for everything from insomnia to syphilis. Holloway built a fortune and even founded a college, all on the back of unverifiable medical claims. Advertisers employed emotionally charged images, crying bobbies, weary mothers, serene sleepers. They used testimonials, pseudoscience, and poetry. One advertisement for a sleep syrup read, "Let not your babe cry in vain. When one spoonful brings peace and rest again." Who wouldn't want peace and rest, in a time when life was so often marked by toil, noise, and grief? An overlooked consequence: the erosion of natural sleep. One of the subtle but profound shifts brought by patent sleep medicines was a redefinition of what sleep should be. Whereas pre-industrial sleep was often segmented, natural, and irregular, the new ideal fueled by advertising was quick, deep, and immediate. Sleep was now something to be induced, controlled, consumed. This had lasting effects on how people understood rest. Insomnia was no longer a normal part of life, it was a symptom to eliminate. Restlessness wasn't a signal from the body, it was a defect. A child who didn't sleep through the night was a problem to be solved chemically. Sleep became a product, and like all products, its solution came with terms and conditions. An unresolved legacy. By the 1880s, as cases of accidental poisoning and addiction became more visible, some medical professionals began sounding the alarm. But reform would take decades and lives. The stage was set for a new era of regulation and scrutiny, but for millions of Victorians, the damage had been done. So one must wonder, did the 19th century bring us closer to rest, or did it simply teach us to chase sleep in bottles and labels? A growing suspicion. By the 1860s and 1870s, physicians and some segments of the public were beginning to notice a disturbing pattern. Infants who had been thriving suddenly became lethargic. Children who had no fever or signs of infection passed away quietly in their sleep. Adults with chronic nerves grew more agitated when they stopped taking their favorite tonic. Elderly patients, long reliant on their nightly syrup, developed tremors and confusion. And yet the bottles in their cupboards remained, untouched by the law. The symptoms were mounting, but a diagnosis was elusive. Addiction was not yet a clearly defined concept in medical circles, certainly not when it came to over-the-counter preparations. Instead, users were often described as morbidly dependent, nervously delicate, or suffering from constitutional weakness. A tragedy of silence was unfolding, spoon by spoon. The apathetic infant syndrome. One of the most chilling aspects of the patent medicine era was the widespread administration of opiate-laced syrups to infants. Historians now refer to the resulting condition as apathetic infant syndrome, a term coined long after the phenomenon was first observed. Infants given regular doses of soothing syrups often displayed floppy limbs, weak sucking reflex, shallow breathing, constant drowsiness, delayed motor development. To struggling mothers in poor or working-class households, this was interpreted not as a warning sign but as a blessing. A quiet baby meant a manageable life. It meant fewer tears during long shifts in textile mills or while doing laundry for wealthy families. The blame for this does not rest on mothers, but on the manufacturers who sold their products as safe, gentle, and modern without disclosing their deadly contents. The respectable drug dependents. Middle-class and upper-class women in particular became some of the most frequent and unsuspecting users of addictive patent medicines, suffering from what was then diagnosed as hysteria, melancholy, or simply nervous exhaustion. These women were often prescribed or sold opium tonics for sleep, chloral hydrate for anxiety, alcoholic bitters for fatigue, cocaine-infused wine for vitality. All were available without prescription. A housewife in 1872 might begin by taking 2 teaspoons of a syrup for restless thoughts. By the end of the month, she might require a tablespoon to feel any relief. By year's end, she could not sleep without it, and any attempt to stop triggered trembling, nightmares, or vomiting. These were not criminals. They were wives, teachers, governesses, and writers, women doing their best in a society that offered them no medical transparency and little autonomy over their health. One newspaper of the time wrote, "She begins with a tonic and ends in ruin, though she keeps her gloves white and her speech composed." The men who profited. Behind the advertisements, behind the cheerful labels and flowery script, were powerful businessmen. Many were not doctors. They were entrepreneurs, skilled in marketing and distribution. Among them, William Radom, who sold Microbe Killer, a liquid containing sulfuric acid and red dye. He claimed it cured everything from cancer to insomnia. James Morrison, who produced Morrison's Pills, herbal laxatives that promised to cleanse the body of impurities and sleeplessness alike. Dr. James, whose fever powder was often given to teething children and occasionally led to convulsions and death. These men operated within a legal vacuum. Without laws to require ingredient disclosure or health testing, their fortunes grew unchecked. Many were revered as public benefactors. They donated to charities, sponsored libraries. Some even built hospitals ironically funded by the very ailments their products helped to cause. The early whistleblowers. A handful of doctors and writers began to speak out. Dr. Theophilus Redwood, a pharmacist and professor, raised alarm in the 1870s about syrups containing morphine. He warned of the growing problem of infant sedation by poison. Dr. William O'Shaughnessy, best known for introducing cannabis to Western medicine, also called for stricter oversight of over-the-counter sedatives. Even famed novelist Charles Dickens touched on the issue obliquely, describing characters whose reliance on unnamed tinctures and pills led to sluggishness and decline. But these voices were few, and they were often drowned out by advertisers who had far more money, more visibility, and no incentive to stop. The role of alcohol. Alongside opiates, alcohol was a mainstay of patent sleep cures. Some preparations were as much as 60–70% alcohol by volume. These were not labeled as spirits, they were marketed as tonics or elixirs. In a time when temperance movements were on the rise, this created a strange contradiction. Individuals who publicly abstained from gin might be dousing themselves nightly with equivalent amounts of ethanol via medicinal syrups. Churchgoers, teachers, even preachers themselves. One satirical newspaper of the time joked, "Better to be a man of medicine than a man of the bottle, though they arrive at the same destination. The United States begins to push back. Interestingly, it was American reformers who began to make the earliest, most sustained push for regulation, particularly journalists. In 1905, journalist Samuel Hopkins Adams published a landmark exposé in Collier's Weekly titled The Great American Fraud. It detailed the ingredients, side effects, and deceptive practices of leading patent medicine companies. Though written decades after the peak of the British patent trade, it echoed its concerns exactly. His reports led to public outcry, and eventually, the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, the first federal law in the U.S. to require labeling of active ingredients. In Britain, it would take longer. The Dangerous Drugs Act of 1920 began regulation of opiates and other substances, but for many, it came far too late. The sleep aids of the Victorian era had already shaped generations. Sleep redefined. As society moved into the 20th century, sleep was no longer just a bodily need, it was a medicalized phenomenon. People had been taught to expect it on demand, to treat wakefulness as a failure, and to reach for solutions not in ritual, rest, or rhythm but in chemistry. And even as regulation improved, the impulse remained, to medicate rather than understand, to solve quickly rather than wait gently. The legacy of 19th century syrups, powders, and pills did not vanish. It evolved into sleeping pills, prescription sedatives, melatonin capsules, and nighttime teas with proprietary blends. We still crave what the Victorians wanted. Sleep now, no questions asked. A quiet epidemic forgotten. Looking back, the tragedy of the 1800s patent medicine era lies not only in the lives lost, but in the silence that followed. These deaths were rarely counted, these addictions rarely named. The grief was personal, often buried, and so we have inherited the structures of their choices but not the stories. And so we must ask, when we reach for rest in a bottle, are we remembering or repeating the past? The slow rise of oversight. It wasn't until the final decade of the 19th century that real efforts to regulate patent medicines took root in Britain. The causes were many. An increase in high-profile infant death linked to sleep syrups. Reports of adult addiction and overdose, often among the middle and upper classes. The growing strength of the British Medical Association, BMA, which began calling for accountability in advertising and manufacturing. Mounting public skepticism toward miracle cures. And yet, even these forces met resistance. The patent medicine industry was not only powerful, it was culturally embedded. To question it was to question a household routine, a mother's intuition, and in some cases, a community's only access to health care. Change, when it came, was quiet and bureaucratic, not dramatic. The British Medical Association steps in. In 1909, the BMA published a comprehensive study titled Secret Remedies: What They Cost and What They Contain. This book was unlike anything the public had seen before. It analyzed dozens of popular medicines in laboratories, published their actual ingredients, side by side with advertising claims, showed that many herbal tonics were mostly alcohol or sugar, revealed that sleep-inducing syrups often contained dangerously high doses of morphine, chloral hydrate, or ether compounds. For example, Mother Siegel's syrup, claimed to cure insomnia and indigestion, found to contain 11% alcohol. Dr. J. Collins Brown's chlorodyne, marketed for coughs, anxiety, and sleeplessness, contained chloroform, morphine, and cannabis. The publication shocked the public and forced manufacturers onto the defensive. For the first time, trust had been breached. Still, there was no immediate ban, only public pressure and slow attrition. Parliament takes notice. Following mounting evidence and pressure from physicians, journalists, and citizens groups, Parliament began drafting legislation. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 had already placed some restriction on poisons, but enforcement was inconsistent. It wasn't until after World War I that real change arrived. The Dangerous Drugs Act, 1920, brought narcotics, including opium and morphine, under strict control. Doctors were required to register prescriptions. The sale of opiates and sedatives without a license was made illegal. Importation of unregulated foreign sleep syrups was sharply reduced. The golden era of syrup for sleep was over, at least in its Victorian form. A new culture of caution. With legal oversight came a cultural shift. Sleep was no longer something purchased casually at the corner shop. Now it was a matter of medical advice, a doctor's concern, a pharmacist's responsibility. For better or worse, the general public lost its direct access to the strongest sleep aids. And with that loss came an increase in hesitation, a fear of dependency, and a new vocabulary of addiction and nervous illness. Sleep itself began to be studied in earnest. Doctors published papers on insomnia. Psychiatrists looked at sleep as a mirror of mental health. No longer a simple function of fatigue or digestion, sleep became part of the scientific and medicalized self. But the legacy of syrupy sleep was not forgotten. Even in the 1930s and 1940s, elderly patients were found still hoarding bottles of old preparations kept behind kitchen tins or in bedroom drawers, tucked away like illicit memories of a different kind of rest. Echoes in the modern era. Today, we can still feel the vibrations of the 19th century every time we step into a pharmacy. Consider the PM, versions of painkillers still promising gentle sleep without fully explaining ingredients. The use of diphenhydramine, an old antihistamine with sedative effects, in dozens of sleep aids. The continued marketing of natural or herbal blends, often with proprietary ingredients. The modern dependence on melatonin, despite ongoing debate about its long-term effects. The overuse of prescription sleep medications, sometimes casually prescribed, often habit-forming. Even the language remains familiar. Restorative, gentle for peaceful sleep, doctor recommended. What has changed is the level of disclosure and the ability to trace and regulate ingredients. But the human need remains the same. We still seek a shortcut to stillness. Human cost uncounted. One of the tragedies of the patent medicine era is that no reliable statistics exist on how many lives were lost or damaged due to overuse, misuse, or mislabeling of sleep tonics. Deaths went unrecorded or were attributed to unrelated causes. Addictions were rarely recognized, let alone treated. The suffering was private, scattered, and often silent. What we do know is this: sleep, when medicalized without oversight, becomes a risky endeavor. And in the 1800s, that risk was accepted not because people were ignorant, but because they were exhausted. They were working 12-hour days. They were raising children alone. They were burying infants, fighting sickness, enduring grief. And in that world, sleep was not a luxury, it was survival. The medicine promised a lifeline. It rarely delivered without cost. A final reflection. Let's return to that dusty apothecary shelf in 1875. You hold a bottle in your hand. The label is faded, the script delicate. It reads, "For sleep, for calm, for the quieting of the mind." You are weary, bone-deep weary. The world has given you no pause. You take the bottle home. You take one spoonful, and for the first time in days, perhaps weeks, the darkness holds you gently. You do not know what's inside. You only know that tonight you will rest. And so we are left with a question that spans centuries. When does the search for rest become its own danger? And how do we know when the cure begins to harm the very peace we seek? Story 4. The Timekeeper's Curse, Sleep Deprivation and the Invention of Industrial Clocks. Time before timekeeping. Close your eyes and imagine yourself on a farm in 1780. There are no clocks in your home. You wake when the sun rises and sleep not long after it sets. Time is measured in events: the crow of the rooster, the ringing of the church bell, the shift of light on your wall. You don't know what time it is. You don't need to. This was the rhythm of most of human history. Sleep came with the dark and waking with the light. Seasons ruled labor. Time was organic, local, and deeply tied to environment. And then the clocks came. This story isn't just about the invention of machines. It's about how one of the most quietly devastating changes in human history, the precise measurement of time, reshaped not just factories and cities, but the body itself, especially the body at rest. The clock's first prisoners, factory workers. The Industrial Revolution began not with fire or steam, but with coordination. In textile mills, coal mines, and ironworks, work could no longer begin around sunup. It had to begin at exactly 5:00 a.m., or 6:30, or the stroke of a factory bell. To achieve this, time had to be standardized, tracked, and enforced. Thus began the widespread use of public clocks, factory bells, and whistles, all designed not to inform, but to compel. The early industrial clock did not sit passively in the corner of a drawing room. It stood in a tower, rang through the streets, and screamed from the mill. Sleep, once flexible and seasonal, was now on the clock. The horological explosion. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, Britain saw an explosion in timekeeping devices. Clockmakers multiplied. Towns installed large public clocks. Pocket watches became symbols of status. And by mid-century, personal alarm clocks had entered domestic life. Each of these clocks carried a silent promise to help you wake on time, not when your body was ready, but when someone else needed you to be awake. Some early personal alarm clocks were ingenious. Spring-wound bells timed to strike at precise hours. Candle clocks, where a candle burned down and dropped a weight onto a bell. Water clocks, slowly filling vessels that tipped at a set time. But all shared one goal: to break sleep, to wake the body whether or not it was rested. Sleep as a problem of scheduling. As timekeeping became more precise, so too did labor. Shifts were no longer measured in vague terms like a day's work or until the job is done. They were measured by the hour, the quarter hour, even the minute. Factory managers tracked lateness obsessively. Some used time books, where clerks recorded employee arrivals to the second. Others installed time clocks, which required workers to punch in using physical tokens or cards. Being late by a few minutes could mean lost wages or dismissal. The result: people forced themselves to sleep quickly, to wake against their will, to compress their rest into arbitrarily scheduled windows. And for the first time, we see the widespread emergence of sleep anxiety. This was the real curse of the timekeeper's world, the creation of a society where rest became guilt. Clocks in the home, time's invasion of the private sphere. Before the 19th century, few homes had clocks. By 1850, clocks were standard in middle-class parlors and increasingly common in working-class homes. The tick became familiar, the chime constant. At first, it was considered a sign of progress. But some writers noticed the change. A letter from 1847 reads, "My father hung the clock in the hall where it beats all night. At first I welcomed its order. Now I cannot sleep for hearing each hour pass, reminding me I am not yet asleep." Sleep was no longer a silent slide into unconsciousness. It was a negotiation with a ticking partner who measured your failure minute by minute. Shift work and fragmented nights. Factories often operated in continuous cycles to maximize output. This required rotating shifts, often changing weekly. 6:00 a.m. to 2:00 p.m. 2:00 p.m. to 10:00 p.m. 10:00 p.m. to 6:00 a.m. Workers on the night shift had to sleep during daylight, often in crowded lodgings or noisy cities. Blackout curtains did not exist, neither did earplugs. These shifts created what one historian calls the unnatural night, a period where workers must sleep out of sync with the sun, their families, and even themselves. A factory girl from Manchester wrote, "I try to sleep at 10 in the morning. The room is hot, the children are playing, and my thoughts still race, but I must wake by 4 to prepare again." Some never adapted. Others turned to alcohol, laudanum, or nerve powders to assist. Sleep became something to catch, not something to enter. Bell towers, whistles, and panic waking. Industrial towns often had bell towers or steam whistles that signaled shift changes. These could be heard for miles. Imagine it is 3:47 a.m. You are asleep in a shared lodging house. You hear the distant hiss of steam, then a shrill whistle. You leap up, heart pounding. You've been trained to fear being late. Your clothes are still damp from yesterday. You dress in silence. The street is already filling with other figures. No one speaks. All are moving toward the same place. This ritual of panic waking became part of the industrial psyche. Even on days off, workers reported phantom alarms, the sensation of having overslept, jolting them awake at odd hours. This kind of chronic sleep disruption was rarely named, but it shaped generations. The clock watchers and their reputation. The term clock watcher arose in this period not to describe timekeepers, but workers eagerly awaiting the end of their shift. It was not a compliment. Employers used the term to shame workers who prioritized rest, leisure, or family over efficiency. To watch the clock was to display laziness. Ironically, the very device that disciplined sleep now became a symbol of moral failure if noticed too closely. This tension reveals a paradox. The worker was meant to live by the clock but not to love it. They were to obey it but never resent it. And at the center of this unspoken contract was sleep denied, controlled, and resented in equal measure. By the mid-19th century, the invention of timekeeping had become more than a technological marvel. It had become a disciplined system, a psychological force, and an enemy of sleep. The body no longer ruled the rhythm of rest the clock did. But how did this relentless measuring of life affect society's views of sleep itself? And in the quest to control the hours, did we begin to forget how to rest without permission? A nation aligned by the clock. By the 1840s, as Britain's railway system expanded, a problem emerged. Every town kept its own local time. Noon in Bristol could be 10 minutes different from noon in London. For most of human history, this posed no issue, but trains needed precision, and so did the mail, and the factories, and the workers. Enter Greenwich Mean Time, GMT. In 1847, British railway companies adopted GMT as the standard for all train schedules. By 1880, it became the official time of the United Kingdom, enforced by law. Suddenly, the entire country was bound to a single, centralized rhythm, one determined not by sunlight or season, but by an observatory in London and the tick of a pendulum clock. It was a triumph of coordination, and the beginning of a national disalignment from the body. The problem of the body clock. Though the term circadian rhythm would not be coined until the 20th century, people had always experienced natural fluctuations in energy, focus, and fatigue. These patterns were shaped by light exposure, meal times, physical activity, and rest. But now, those rhythms had to bend, often violently, to the requirements of the workday. A worker who felt alert at 10 p.m. had to wake at 5 a.m. A baker finishing an early shift might go to sleep at noon. A railway dispatcher could alternate between daytime and overnight weeks. The clock did not care whether the body was ready. This clash was more than just inconvenient, it was exhausting. In letters and personal diaries, Workers describe difficulty falling asleep on command, waking throughout the night, worried about the morning bell, fatigue that sleep didn't seem to cure, dreams filled with clocks, bells, or factory sounds. One Lancashire miner wrote, "I am tired at waking and no more rested for sleeping. My bones lie down, but my thoughts go on sorting the day ahead." Clock discipline in schools. Children were not spared from time discipline. As industrialization touched all aspects of society, schools began adopting strict schedules modeled after factories. Bells signaled the start of lessons. Breaks were timed to the minute. Tardiness was punished, sometimes physically. Some classrooms even displayed factory-style time cards or charts of ideal daily hours. Sleep became something to manage not just in the home, but in the institution. Children were instructed in time hygiene, an early form of schedule setting intended to prepare them for punctual adult labor. This had two consequences. Sleep became tied to obedience and performance. Children began to internalize guilt for drowsiness, even when natural. Shift work and the sleep of the poor. Though the middle and upper classes could afford to arrange their days around comfort, the working poor had no such luxury. Many worked split shifts, a few hours in the morning, then again late at night. Sleep came in fragments, sometimes on hard benches, shop floors, or not at all. A factory worker might rise at 4:30 a.m., work 5:00 to 9:00, return home to sleep 2-3 hours, report back from 3:00 to 9:00 p.m., sleep again fitfully until dawn. This fractured schedule made deep, restorative sleep nearly impossible. Over time, the body adjusted not by adapting but by breaking down. Chronic fatigue, increased workplace accidents, early aging, digestive and emotional disorders, a general state of nervous irritability. These were not considered medical conditions. They were the price of being alive in an industrial age. The tick inside the mind. As clocks became omnipresent, they invaded not just homes and schools but the mind. Workers and even managers began reporting a strange condition, the phantom ticking. After years of living by rigid schedules, some individuals claimed they could hear a ticking clock even in silence. Others dreamt of clock faces, swinging pendulums, or hours vanishing. This wasn't madness, it was the internalization of time discipline. One letter from 1891 describes a railway porter who, after 20 years of waking at 3:45 a.m., never slept past 3:30 again, even after retirement. Another described panic attacks upon hearing bells, associating them with missed shifts. These were the psychological residues of timekeeping, a kind of chronological trauma. The machine no longer needed to chime. It had been implanted. Sleep as productivity. One of the most insidious changes brought by industrial timekeeping was a shift in why people slept. Historically, sleep had been a time of dreaming, regeneration, or spiritual reflection. But now it was increasingly seen as a means to an end, to be useful the next day. New moral slogans emerged. Early to bed, early to rise, makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. Waste not an hour, lest you waste the day. To oversleep was to be lazy. To nap was indulgent. To rest in daylight, shameful. Even rest was now expected to be scheduled, efficient, and productive. Time and the female sleeper. While male workers bore the brunt of shift labor, women, especially in urban homes, faced another form of sleep discipline: domestic clockwork. Household manuals began prescribing exact times for rising, meal preparation, child bathing, and cleaning routines. Sleep was permitted only after tasks were complete. One 1883 guide advised, A good wife is asleep no later than 10 and awake no later than 6. Delay in rising is theft from her family. Working-class women employed in factories, laundries, or markets had even less room to rest. Many rose before dawn to care for children, worked 10-hour days, and returned to continue labor at home. There was no sanctioned time for sleep, only cracks between obligations. By the end of the 19th century, the industrial clock had reshaped nearly every aspect of daily life. It coordinated society, but it also fragmented sleep, rewrote rest, and turned night into a battleground between body and bell. What had once been a natural rhythm was now a calculated pause in productivity. And so we ask, if the clock taught us to wake on command, can it ever teach us how to rest again? The invention of sleep as a science. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, something curious began to happen. After nearly a century of compressing, fragmenting, and disciplining rest, society began to look at sleep not as a luxury or a weakness, but as a medical subject worthy of study. In 1894, a British physician named Richard Hammond published one of the first English-language books devoted entirely to the subject, sleep and its derangements. Though primitive by modern standards, the book made a bold claim. Sleep is not mere idleness but a vital function, with clear rules and causes. Other physicians followed, especially in Germany and France. Sleep began to be studied through the lens of nervous exhaustion, mental health, and even industrial productivity. Why? Because the cracks were showing. Workers were collapsing, mistakes were increasing. Industrial accidents, especially in factories, railways, and mining, were being linked to fatigue. And for the first time, employers and governments began to ask a once unthinkable question. Could rest be as important as labor? The birth of sleep hygiene. From these early studies came one of the strangest products of the industrial age. Sleep hygiene, a term used to describe habits, routines, and environmental choices that promote efficient sleep. Sleep hygiene guides became popular among urban professionals in the 1890s and 1900s. They advised readers to go to bed and rise at the same hour daily, even on weekends. Avoid heavy meals after 7:00 p.m. Open windows for fresh air. Take a lukewarm bath, not a hot one. Read only dull material before bed. Keep clocks out of the bedroom. Avoid arguments, debts, or legal thinking at night. In some ways, these guides were helpful. They recognized that modern life had disrupted natural rest, but they also framed sleep as yet another system to optimize, to control, to discipline. Even rest now required a manual. The factory alarm clock, friend or foe. By 1900, alarm clocks were mass-produced, inexpensive, and ubiquitous. Almost every household had one. Some had several. They were marvels of engineering, beautiful in brass, with keys and bells and ticking hands. But to many, they were also objects of dread. A poem printed in a 1905 Manchester Workers' magazine reads, "The bell I wind, the time I trust. My sleep obeys its will, not mine. And though I dream of fields and dust, I wake beneath the factory's chime." The alarm clock no longer simply announced the time. It ended dreams, started days, and if ignored carried consequences. Some workers began to report chronic anxiety about sleeping through alarms, leading to trouble falling asleep, waking throughout the night to check the time, developing the habit of rising before the alarm rang. Sleep became not only compressed, but policed by expectation. The tired manager. While much of the industrial toll was borne by the working class, employers and timekeepers were not immune. Factory managers, business owners, and supervisors also lived under the yoke of time. Many began to suffer from what was called nervous dyspepsia, a mix of indigestion, insomnia, irritability, and malaise, often caused by mental overstimulation. Unlike laborers, these men rarely lifted anything. Their fatigue was mental and just as exhausting. A few even began to retire early, citing nervous strain or sleep troubles as the cause. Doctors prescribed extended vacations to the countryside, milk-only diets, naps in darkened rooms, mild electrical stimulation of the scalp, books with minimal narrative content to read at night. One doctor even suggested staring at the second hand of a clock for 15 minutes to lull the mind into drowsiness, a poetic irony for those whose lives were ruled by that very device. The cost of uniform time. Though much good came from synchronized time rail safety, predictable communication, modern scheduling, the costs were more personal and far harder to measure. What was lost? Local timekeeping, once based on community rhythms and natural light. Seasonal variation, where winter invited longer sleep and summer shorter. Segmented sleep, the old pattern of sleeping in two stretches with a midnight interlude of calm wakefulness. Social sleep, when families shared rhythms, stories, and quiet together. In its place, we gained efficiency, but at the cost of sleep that listened to the body. And the strangest irony, we created machines to tell us when to wake, but we've never invented one to teach us how to rest. Echoes today. Even now, the 19th century whispers through our nights. We rise to alarms instead of sunlight. We count sleep in hours, not cycles. We speak of sleep productivity, of wasted time in bed. We use apps to track dreams and blue light filters to trick the body. We worry if we don't fall asleep quickly enough. In this, we are not so far from the factory worker watching the clock or the postman jolted awake by the whistle. We are still centuries later, living in the world they built. Closing reflection. Let's return briefly to a room in 1850. A clock ticks. Outside, the street is still. A man in a small bed opens one eye. It is not yet time, but he rises anyway. The factory bell will ring soon. Better to be early than to risk being late. He does not know it, but he is among the first humans in history to wake not by nature, but by design. His body is tired, but the clock has won. And so we ask, if time gave us order, but stole our rest, how do we learn to sleep freely again? Story 5, Whispers in the Asylum, How 19th Century Psychiatry Handled Insomnia. The Asylum at Midnight. It is 1883. You are standing outside the gates of the Bethlehem Royal Hospital, better known by its nickname, Bedlam. Inside its stone walls lie hundreds of patients, men and women diagnosed with disorders ranging from melancholia to mania, epilepsy to hysteria. But there is something else that afflicts nearly every person within these walls, something rarely listed in the records, yet omnipresent in the corridors of the Victorian asylum: insomnia. Night is rarely silent here. Some patients cry softly in the dark. Others pace, mutter, or pray. Some stare at the ceiling, wide-eyed, as hours pass. Still others fall into uneasy, fragmented slumber, only to wake disoriented and agitated. Sleep in these places is both a symptom and a treatment, both withheld and prescribed. This is the story of how psychiatry in the 19th century came to understand, misunderstand, and attempt to control restless minds through the lens of sleep. Madness and the sleep problem. In the 1800s, sleep disorders were not seen as medical conditions of their own. They were considered manifestations of something deeper, typically moral or mental weakness, spiritual imbalance, or constitutional instability. Insomnia was thought to be both a cause and a consequence of mental illness. Melancholic patients were said to be kept awake by brooding thoughts. Maniacal patients raved through the night without need of rest. Hysterics were often described as disordered in sleep, in appetite, and in spirit. And in the asylum, sleep became the gold standard of improvement. A patient who slept well was on the mend. A patient who did not sleep was watched more closely, restrained more often, and medicated more heavily. In other words, rest became a tool of control. The night watchers. Victorian asylums employed night attendants orderlies who moved silently through the wards with lanterns, checking on patients. Their tasks were not just to ensure safety, but to record sleep patterns. In the patient logbooks of places like the York Retreat, Hanwell Asylum, and Colney Hatch, we find notations like, "Did not sleep, agitated throughout. Slept fitfully, rose twice to walk in circle. Woke shrieking, restrained until calm. Gave opiate at 2:10 a.m., drowsy by 2:40. These logs were used to justify further treatment or confinement. Patients who didn't sleep were considered dangerous to themselves or others. Their lack of rest was not seen as a side effect of illness, but evidence of it. In some asylums, patients were expected to be asleep by a designated hour, often 8:00 or 9:00 p.m. Those who remained awake past this were called resistors or disturbers of the ward. The methods of inducing sleep. With sleep so valued, and its absence feared, asylum doctors turned to every tool available to enforce it. Sedatives and opiates. The most common tools were chemical. Laudanum, a tincture of opium. Chloral hydrate, an early synthetic sedative introduced in the 1860s. Potassium bromide, used for seizures, also produced drowsiness. Cannabis tinctures, occasionally used for anxious or agitated patients. Ether or chloroform, administered in rare, severe cases. These drugs were poorly dosed, inconsistently recorded, and often dangerously addictive. Some patients began to request them themselves, seeing them as the only escape from mental torment or the ward itself. Physical restraints and sleep enforcers. Sleep was also induced through non-chemical means. Wrapping, patients were swaddled tightly in sheets to calm agitation. Straitjackets, used to prevent self-harm but also to force rest. Locked sleep rooms, padded, darkened chambers where patients were placed alone for hours. Forced bed rest. Some patients were confined to beds for days to recover their natural rhythm. Though some staff believed these methods humane, many patients described them as terrifying. And for those already fearful or hallucinating, enforced stillness could deepen panic rather than relieve it. The silence of the night. At night, asylums became soundscapes of suffering. Reports from attendants and visiting inspectors describe moaning, whispering, sobbing, rhythmic thudding, patients hitting walls or heads, frantic prayers repeated endlessly, laughter sudden and wild, complete, eerie silence broken only by the ticking of the ward clock. This atmosphere had a strange effect on staff, too. Night workers reported difficulty sleeping during the day. Some spoke of becoming numb to noise, others haunted by it. One wrote, "There are sounds in the asylum that never quite leave you. They are not loud, but they are endless." Sleep as a diagnostic tool. Doctors began to track sleep in charts, looking for patterns. A patient who went 3 nights without rest was likely to be moved to more intensive supervision. Those whose sleep returned were considered good candidates for discharge or outdoor walks. But the assumptions behind this were flawed. Patients learned to fake sleep to avoid attention. Others were punished for waking, even if distressed. There was little room for natural sleep rhythms. No allowance for early risers, segmented sleepers, or those who needed less rest. The asylum's rhythm was rigid, and deviation, even in sleep, was pathologized. Moral treatment and rest. Some asylums, like the York Retreat, experimented with more compassionate approaches. Influenced by Quaker principles, they believed that environment, kindness, and routine could help calm disturbed minds. Here, sleep was encouraged through quiet reading, gentle conversation, warm baths, hearty but simple dinners, regular exercise in garden spaces. Even so, patients were still expected to conform to structured rest times. And when sleep didn't come, the same tools, sedatives, confinement were still available. When sleep refused to return, there were patients who, despite every effort, did not sleep. These individuals were often labeled chronic cases. Some were diagnosed as incurable. Others were moved to isolation wards or long-term beds. Their lack of sleep became their identity. One doctor wrote, "Her eyes are ever open. She speaks to no one. She sleeps not, yet dreams. We have given all known aids. It is as though she has left the world without dying." In these tragic cases, the line between wakefulness and madness blurred completely. As the 19th century progressed, psychiatry began to understand the mind as a system disordered but treatable. But sleep, so essential to mental peace, remained a mystery, a battleground, and too often, a tool of coercion. The asylum walls echoed not just with illness, but with the sound of thousands of unslept nights. So we must wonder, when sleep is enforced, is it truly rest or merely silence mistaken for peace? Sleep as the mirror of the mind. By the 1870s, physicians in leading asylums across Europe began to see sleep not just as a sign of stability, but as a window into the psyche. If the waking patient was incoherent, restless, or withdrawn, perhaps their sleep and dreams might offer a truer diagnosis. Doctors like Dr. George Savage at Bethlehem Royal Hospital began asking patients about their dreams, if they remembered them. Did they dream of past trauma? Were they plagued by nightmares? Were their dreams coherent, symbolic, or repetitive? Some psychiatrists believed that recurring dreams revealed the nature of a patient's disorder, melancholics dreaming of death or falling, the maniacal of grandeur or divine purpose, the hysteric of persecution or shame. For the first time, sleep was not just absence of wakefulness. It was beginning to be seen as a mental realm in itself, one that might be charted, interpreted, and perhaps healed. But not everyone agreed. The skeptics and the sleep deniers. Not all physicians trusted dreams or even believed in the possibility of mental rest within the asylum. Some insisted that the mind could not truly sleep if it was already diseased. 1881 asylum manual warned, "Do not confuse dormancy with peace. Many lunatics sleep, yet the storm continues beneath." These doctors focused more on behavioral markers, whether patients lay still, ceased vocalizations, or appeared drowsy after sedation. Dreaming was often dismissed as mental noise, meaningless in the clinical ledger. This created a disconnect. For patients who suffered from disturbing or vivid dreams, there was little comfort and often no outlet. Their reports of night terrors were dismissed as attention-seeking or delusion. In this way, the asylum became a place where dreams were both pathologized and ignored. Women's sleep and the hysterical night. In many asylums, female patients made up nearly half or more of the population. Diagnoses such as hysteria, neurasthenia, and puerperal insanity were common, and sleep was often central to their treatment or mistreatment. Doctors believed that women were especially vulnerable to sleep disorders because of their weaker nerves, impressionable nature, and delicate constitution. Insomnia in women was frequently attributed to disruption of the menstrual cycle, emotional instability or loss, grief, heartbreak, moral failing such as jealousy, pride, or vanity, sexual frustration or overstimulation. To remedy this, female patients were often prescribed sleep, not just as recovery but as reform. They were instructed to rest for long hours, sometimes up to 18 hours per day, as part of a regimen known as the rest cure. Popularized by Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell, the rest cure became infamous for enforced bed rest for weeks or even months, prohibition of reading, writing, or conversation, high-fat diets of milk, eggs, and meat, massage and electrotherapy, isolation from family, friends, and stimulus. Though a few patients reported improvement, many, especially women, described the treatment as dehumanizing and mentally destructive. Among them was Charlotte Perkins Gilman, whose experience inspired her story The Yellow Wallpaper, a haunting account of a woman confined, silenced, and slowly unraveling. Nightmares as proof of madness. One particular belief that flourished in the late Victorian asylum was the diagnostic weight of nightmares. A patient who suffered from vivid, repetitive nightmares was seen as a case of deeply disturbed moral consciousness. This belief was rooted in the older, puritanical idea that nightmares were visitations of guilt or even demonic presence. A man dreaming of being buried alive, night after night, might be seen not just as troubled, but criminal in his soul. This led some doctors to pursue moral interrogation after nightmares. What sin did you dream of? Did you see your victim? What voice called your name? In such interrogations, the line blurred between psychiatry and confessional, between dream and judgment. Some patients, confused and frightened, began to lie about their dreams to avoid further scrutiny or punishment. Night treatments and experimental tactics. To deal with sleepless patients, particularly the violently restless, some asylums experimented with controversial methods. Among them, one, sleep deprivation as reset. In some cases, patients were kept awake for over 48 hours under the belief that extended fatigue would eventually collapse the mind into a restful state. This often resulted in delirium, hallucinations, or collapse, but doctors sometimes reported a miraculous calm afterward. 2. Cold sheets and bathing. Cold compresses or full-body immersion in cold water were applied at night to calm the body and reduce nervous heat. Some patients were wrapped in cold, wet sheets and left in quiet rooms to cool their agitation. 3. Music or hypnosis. A few progressive doctors attempted to soothe patients using music boxes, soft singing, or rudimentary hypnotic suggestion. Though rare, some records show that patients reported deeper rest after these sessions, though the effects were inconsistent. Institutional soundscapes and environmental design. By the late 19th century, some asylums began to experiment with environmental design to improve sleep and reduce nighttime agitation. These included quieter flooring and shoes for attendants, padded doors to prevent noise from echoing, curtains and dim lanterns to reduce light during rounds, private rooms for chronic insomniacs or aggressive sleepers, ventilation improvements for better air circulation. In rare cases, gardens were opened at night for supervised walks among moonlight and plants a brief moment of peace in an otherwise oppressive environment. One doctor wrote, "There is something soothing in the smell of soil and the rustle of leaves by gaslight. A few of my patients sleep better for it, and so do I." Sleep records and the attempt to quantify rest. In pursuit of scientific legitimacy, asylum doctors began recording hours slept, episodes of night agitation, and dream recall in greater detail. Ledgers from institutions like St. Bernard's and Broadmoor display full columns for bedtime and rise time, disturbances per night, medications and effects, changes in sleep after dietary adjustment, observations on demeanor in the morning. These were early forerunners to what we now call sleep studies, though they lacked any technological measurement. Still, they represent a shift. Rest was becoming measurable, recordable, and trackable. But for many patients, their sleep could not be tallied by hours alone. Their exhaustion ran deeper than numbers. As the century turned, psychiatry began to understand that rest was more than a physical act, it was a mental necessity. But in seeking to control and categorize sleep, asylums often buried its mystery under rules, treatments, and suspicion. Patients lay still. Some dreamed of escape, others dreamed of silence. A few, perhaps, dreamed of nothing at all. And so we ask, if we dream behind locked doors, does anyone hear us when we wake? From asylum to laboratory, sleep becomes a subject. As the 19th century gave way to the early 20th, the tide began to turn in the medical understanding of sleep. Psychiatry, still in its formative years, had long viewed sleep disorders as secondary symptoms, byproducts of deeper mental or moral disturbances. But now, as neurology, experimental psychology, and sleep physiology began to emerge as distinct fields, sleep started to receive attention in its own right. Researchers like Marie de Manisane in Russia and Henry Head in England began to test sleep deprivation directly not just on the mentally ill, but on themselves and healthy volunteers. De Manisane even killed puppies in experiments of sleep removal, not to study dreams or madness, but to ask, what happens when the body and brain are denied rest entirely? The answer was clear if grim: sleep was not optional. Without it, even the most balanced minds deteriorated. Delirium, confusion, hallucination, these did not arise from pathology alone, but from the simple absence of rest. And so, ironically, the most powerful insight into asylum insomnia came not from the asylum itself, but from the laboratory. The first sleep clinics, outside the asylum walls. In 1903, a French neurologist named Henri Perrin began researching sleep as a physiological phenomenon, charting patterns of fatigue, rest, and recovery. He argued that sleep wasn't just the brain shutting off, it was a cycle, governed by internal rhythms, chemistry, and stimulus. This understanding would take decades to develop fully, but it laid the foundation for the first non-psychiatric sleep clinics in Europe. Here, patients with chronic insomnia were examined not as madmen, but as individuals with potentially treatable conditions. They were observed, not confined, asked to describe their habits, not their sins, given lifestyle guidance, not sedatives or shackles. It was a small revolution, but a meaningful one. Asylum sleep, forgotten sleep. Despite progress elsewhere, most psychiatric hospitals, especially in Britain, the US, and Germany, continued old practices into the early 20th century. Sleep was still, controlled by bell schedules and lights-out policies, monitored through staff observations, interpreted as a sign of obedience or rebellion, manipulated through sedatives, wrapping, and confinement. Patients still faked rest to avoid being classified as disturbed. Some feared their dreams would be used against them. Others simply gave up and lay still, staring at ceilings until morning. In this, sleep had become something tragic, a performance, a test, a punishment, a reward, rarely, almost never, a refuge. The case of Mary B., a story in fragments. Among the many anonymous casebooks from Victorian asylums, one entry recurs strangely, over 14 months, at St. Luke's Hospital in London. Her name is listed only as Mary B. She was admitted in the spring of 1879 for what was described as night raving, persistent wakefulness, and hysterical visions. Early notes read, has not slept in 3 days, eyes red, refuses food. Shrieks at night, believes she is being watched through the window. Given bromide, no effect, restrained. In later entries, speaks calmly during the day, but continues to fear the dark. Admits she does not want to sleep, says dreams show her the past. Her nightmares have become waking visions. Consents to sedation only when spoken to gently. Then abruptly, slept 5 hours, first time since arrival. 1 month later, transferred to quiet ward, sleeps without aid. And then silence. We never hear what happened to Mary B. We do not know if she recovered, was discharged, or died. But her story is one of thousands fragments of lives reshaped by insomnia and by the systems that misunderstood it. Modern eyes on a forgotten night. Today, we know far more about the science of sleep. REM cycles, circadian rhythms, the role of melatonin and cortisol, the relationship between trauma, depression, and insomnia. We build clinics to measure it. We train therapists to treat it without drugs. We track it on our wrists, read articles about it in magazines, and worry when we don't get enough. But the roots of that modern anxiety lie partly in places like the 19th century asylum, where sleep was both salvation and threat, both diagnosis and cure. Even now, the language lingers. Restless mind, sleeping pills. You're not yourself without sleep. Go lie down until you feel better. What we call rest is still a moral script, a way to sort the healthy from the unwell, the disciplined from the wayward. A final reflection. Picture the ward again. It is midnight. The gaslight flickers. An attendant walks quietly past rows of iron-framed beds. A woman lies still, eyes open, unmoving. A man mutters in his sleep. Another bangs softly on the wall once every 10 seconds, not loud enough to disturb the others, just enough to keep himself from disappearing into silence. And somewhere far down the corridor, a nurse makes another mark in a book. Patient not yet asleep. Not yet. And so we ask, if rest is forced, can it ever truly heal? Or does real sleep require not silence but freedom? Story 6. Coal dust and counting sheep. Miners' fatigue and the fight for rest. Down the shaft. Imagine the hour is just past 3 in the morning. It is 1874. You stand at the lip of the South Hetton Colliery in County Durham, England. The fog is thick. The wind cuts sideways across the moor, and below your feet, more than 1,000 feet down, hundreds of men and boys are at work digging coal, clearing rubble, and heaving carts along narrow, collapsing tunnels. They are not new to this. Some have worked these shifts for decades. Some are only 12 years old. They are coal miners, and for them, sleep is not rest. It is a negotiation, a desperate barter between the body and the clock. This is the story of how industrial labor, especially in the coal mining world of 19th century Britain and America, reshaped the very concept of rest, and how the lack of sleep, its structure, its space, and its very value became a silent crisis. The shift that never ends. Coal mining was one of the most grueling, dangerous, and poorly regulated professions of the industrial age. By the 1840s, tens of thousands of men and boys labored underground for up to 14 hours a day, often 6 days a week. There were 3 major shifts in larger collieries. Early shift starting between 2:00 and 4:00 a.m. Day shift starting around 10:00 a.m. Afternoon night shift extending until midnight or later. Miners were woken before dawn, often after only 4 or 5 hours of sleep. They descended into dark tunnels with carbide lamps strapped to their heads and emerged again at dusk or deep night, covered in soot and barely coherent. And yet, there were no complaints, at least not openly. Sleep in these communities was seen as a luxury. Rest was for the weak. Men who napped in public were shamed. Sleepiness was a mark of laziness unless, of course, it happened on your one rest day, when it was considered acceptable to collapse until the bells rang again. Where did they sleep? In mining towns, housing was often provided by the coal companies themselves. These were typically rows of terrace cottages, clustered near the mine. Inside, space was tight, sometimes only 2 rooms for families of 8 or more. Miners slept on straw mattresses or directly on floorboards. Young boys often shared a bed or pallet, 2 or 3 to a space. Privacy was non-existent. Ventilation was poor. The smell of smoke, sweat, and coal dust filled the rooms. Some households tried to organize sleep in shifts, older sons sleeping while younger ones worked, fathers resting while mothers took on domestic labor. But most families simply slept when they could, wherever they could. And even in the quietest moment, sleep was fragile. Children cried, carts passed outside, factory horns sounded the shift changes, and in their dreams many miners reported hearing the low, rumbling echo of explosions, whether real or imagined. Fatigue as a public hazard. The lack of sleep among miners wasn't just a private misery, it had deadly consequences. Mine disasters. Many of the worst mining accidents of the 19th century, the Oaks Colliery explosion, 1866, the Hartley Colliery disaster, 1862, and the Avondale mine fire, 1869, Pennsylvania, occurred during early or night shifts. Investigators often noted poor judgment, delayed reactions, improper equipment handling, missed safety checks. Behind these were overworked, sleep-deprived bodies, running on instinct and fear. The sleepwalking miners. There are documented cases of miners falling asleep on their feet while pushing wagons or digging. One record from West Yorkshire reads, "Worker lost hold of lamp, fell to knees, and did not wake until pulled by mate. Said he was in his bed in dream, could not understand what had happened." Another entry from an inspector in Ohio. Boy of 14 found asleep beside coal tub, struck by moving cart, survived but jaw shattered, reported dreaming of breakfast table. These stories were not rare. In fact, they were common enough to be accepted, even expected. Miners didn't resist the fatigue. They simply accepted it as part of the job. The cultural shame of sleep. In mining communities, rest was not celebrated. It was a problem to solve. Men who fell asleep during sermons or union meetings were scolded. Fathers who napped on their only day off were mocked by neighbors. Even sleep itself was described in suspicious terms. He's gone soft. The man needs to harden. Rests for widows and poets. This shame filtered into family life. Sons were taught to wake early without prompting. Boys were expected to imitate their fathers, exhaustion not to fight it. And women, too, were often blamed if the men in their households overslept. One miner's wife wrote in a private letter, "If he does not rise by 3, I am made the cause. Yet I sleep barely 2 hours between the children and the baking." Sleep in this world was not refuge. It was evidence of failure. Alternative rest, the half-nap culture. Because long, uninterrupted sleep was nearly impossible, miners adapted by developing a kind of fragmented rest culture. Quick naps taken at midday, often while seated. Sleeping upright against mine walls between carts. Falling asleep fully clothed the moment they returned home. Church sleep, nodding off during Sunday services, when possible. These forms of rest were tolerated, even joked about, but rarely respected. A man could doze, yes, but he should wake instantly if called. Anything more was seen as indulgence. The result was chronic exhaustion, normalized and untreated. Medical observations and neglect. Despite widespread fatigue among miners, few doctors studied their sleep or lack thereof. Most medical interest focused on black lung, injuries, and malnutrition. Only a handful of physicians even mentioned rest in their treatment plans. One such exception was Dr. John B. Haldane, a pioneering physiologist who, while studying air quality in mines in the 1890s, noted, "It is not merely the foulness of the air or the heat that afflicts the miner. It is the ceaseless fatigue. He comes home with no breath and no fire in the eye, and yet is expected to rise again with the rooster." But these insights were rare. Sleep was invisible in policy, planning, and worker advocacy. Even the early labor unions focused more on wages and safety than rest. As the industrial age demanded more from the body, Miners and their families found ways to endure without ever quite recovering. Sleep became strategic, segmented, and shameful. The modern obsession with sleep hygiene, bedtime routines, blackout curtains, sleep trackers would seem laughable to a 19th century coal miner. For him, sleep was simple. You sleep when you can, you wake when you must. And so we wonder, when exhaustion becomes the norm, how do you know if you're ever truly rested again? The bedroom as battlefield. For miners in the 19th century, the bed was not a refuge, it was merely a staging ground between shifts. The homes they returned to were often built by the coal companies, packed close together, with walls so thin you could hear every cough, every pot stirred, every baby cry. Rest was rare, and privacy rarer still. A typical miner's bedroom might have a straw-stuffed mattress on a wooden frame, or even just boards. One or two threadbare blankets shared between father and sons. A cracked window, often stuffed with cloth or newspaper to keep out the chill. Coal dust tracked across the floor and settled in the corners like soot snow. Multiple generations shared the same room. If a miner was lucky enough to have a bed to himself, it was likely only because another family member was out working the opposite shift. These homes were not designed for comfort, they were built for control. The company owned them, often deducted rent directly from wages, and could evict at any time. Complaints about poor sleeping conditions were often met with indifference or threats. The result: generational fatigue, tired men raising tired sons. Women and the management of rest. While the miners dug deep underground, the women above were expected to manage the domestic rhythms, including the delicate balance of sleep. This included timing meals so that they coincided with a husband's return, no matter the hour. Keeping children quiet during daytime sleep for fathers on night shifts. Refraining from cleaning or laundry near the bedroom when men were resting. Being awake when miners returned, ready to wash their backs or remove boots. If a man awoke irritable, it was often blamed on the wife's failures in creating a restful environment. Women, too, were exhausted, but their fatigue remained invisible. Few mining accounts of the time record the labor of women as physical. They were simply expected to endure. In letters and oral histories, women describe their own dreams, often of fields, open air, or silence. These were not aspirations, they were wishes made in moments between the children's cries and the creaking of floors. The cultural beliefs around dreams. Though sleep was undervalued, dreams held strange power in coal communities. Miners were often deeply religious or superstitious. A dream could be seen as a warning, especially dreams of collapse, fire, or drowning. A message from the dead, former miners or family members. A divine premonition, sometimes prompting a worker to skip a shift. There are dozens of documented cases in which a miner claimed to have foreseen a disaster in a dream and stayed home. Some were mocked. Others were later revered if tragedy struck. 1887 Welsh record notes. Miner stayed abed, fearing dream of dust and flame. Pit explosion that day took 17 souls, now called the dreamer by neighbors. These stories contributed to a respect for night visions, even among otherwise stoic men. In this way, dreams became a strange paradox, ignored in science but feared in life. Remedies for sleeplessness. When miners could not sleep, a condition called simply the fret or the shakes, remedies were homegrown, often passed down through women or elders. Some included ale with laudanum, a few drops of opium in beer. Hot brick wrapped in flannel, placed at the foot of the bed. Salt under the pillow, to ward off dreams. Chalk lines drawn on doorposts, to protect against night spirits. Reading the Psalms aloud, particularly Psalm 4:8, I will both lay me down in peace and sleep. Doctors rarely visited for insomnia. If they did, They prescribed either more laudanum or simply advised the miner to take a walk, breathe the air, and be a man. No attention was given to noise levels, work hours, or chronic exhaustion. To not sleep was a failure, but to admit to sleeplessness was worse. Early movements for labor rest. The 19th century labor movement slowly began to consider not just wages and safety, but rest. Early union pamphlets and rally speeches started including lines like, "The man who never sleeps is the man who dies early. Rest is the right of the worker. No man should rise before God's son." These sentiments gained traction especially after mining disasters, where sleep-deprived errors were increasingly acknowledged. In 1889, the British Miners' Federation called for shorter workdays, ideally 8 hours, mandatory rest periods between shifts, alternating shift systems to prevent cumulative fatigue. These demands were radical and largely ignored for decades, but the seed had been planted. Rest was no longer just personal comfort, it was a labor right. Sleep and death, a shared ritual. In coal towns, death was constant. Explosions, cave-ins, suffocation, and disease claimed hundreds each year. Funerals often took place in the early morning just before a new shift. Men would attend in boots, jackets covered in coal dust. They would bow their heads, listen to brief sermons, and then walk straight to the mines. Rest was not granted for grief. One miner recalled, "We buried him at 6, and by 7 I was on the trolley. My hands still smelled of oil and pine from the box." Sleep and death blurred together. In eulogies, the dead were often described as finally resting or laid to peace. It was the only sleep truly respected. As 19th century miners fought fatigue with grit, superstition, and endurance, they left behind a strange legacy. A world where sleep was feared, desired, punished, and sacred all at once. In this dark mirror, we glimpse the beginning of modern sleep deprivation culture when the body becomes a machine, and rest is seen as its most shameful error. And so we ask, when the bed becomes a battlefield, can the soul ever find stillness? The early warnings, sleep as survival. By the dawn of the 20th century, the signs were undeniable. Chronic sleep deprivation was not just harming individual miners, it was fraying the fabric of entire communities. Doctors began documenting the symptoms among colliery workers. Tremors, memory loss, mood instability, hallucinations during waking hours, sudden blackouts near active machinery. In one 1904 testimony before a labor commission in Pennsylvania, a mine inspector stated, "I've seen men blink like owls in full daylight, unable to recall where they were meant to be or what job they'd been assigned that morning. They work too long. They sleep too little. It is killing them slowly." Yet sleep was still missing from the legal vocabulary of labor. Wages were counted, hours were timed, safety was debated, but rest, that was left to chance. The birth of the 8-hour day. Amid the rise of union activism in the early 20th century, miners began to adopt a powerful new slogan. 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. It was not just poetry, it was rebellion. This phrase, widely attributed to British socialist Robert Owen in the 1830s, was resurrected by American and European labor organizers around the 1900s. For miners, it carried enormous weight. It promised not only fairer labor but protected sleep, a right to turn off the body without shame or punishment. Miners' strikes in Britain, especially the 1912 National Coal Strike, and in the U.S., such as the West Virginia Mine Wars, increasingly included calls for mandatory rest periods, regular sleep schedules, and time off for recovery from overnight shifts. It took decades, but by the mid-20th century, many coal fields had adopted 8-hour shifts, rotating over 24 hours. Legal rest periods between shifts became standard. Underground sleeping was discouraged and even penalized for safety, yes, but also because real sleep was being recognized as essential. Company towns lose control. As labor protections expanded, company-owned housing declined. Workers were no longer forced to live where they worked. They moved out of cramped terraces and into towns of their own choosing. With that came small revolutions in how miners slept. Separate bedrooms for children and parents, improved ventilation and bedding, thicker walls, reducing noise between homes, personal sleep routines, unregulated by the mind's bell. Miners began to speak of sleep with pride rather than apology. One Welsh miner in 1938 told a visiting journalist, "I sleep like a king now. You can't hear the whistles here. I wake up when I wish." This shift, modest though it was, signaled a cultural turn. Sleep was no longer weakness. It was a recovery, a reward, a right. The psychology of the night shift. Despite progress, night shifts never disappeared. In fact, they became more common as electricity and mechanization made 24-hour mining profitable. What changed, however, was the scientific understanding of how these shifts disrupted the body. By the 1950s, researchers were studying circadian rhythm disruption, delayed sleep phase syndrome, the role of melatonin and light exposure, the long-term effects of rotating shifts on heart health and cognition. This research helped drive better scheduling, sleep education, and eventually the invention of sleep clinics. And yet the stigma of sleepiness still lingered. Workers who asked for extra rest were seen, in some cases, as less tough, less loyal, or simply less manly. Even today, that belief hasn't fully vanished. Sleep and identity. As coal towns aged into the late 20th century and the industry declined, some of the toughest stories to tell were not about mining, but about what came after. Retired miners often spoke of decades of poor sleep catching up with them. Startling awake at 3:00 a.m., the old shift time. Nightmares about cave-ins or collapsing beams. The inability to nap, even when tired. Chronic insomnia, decades after retirement. Their bodies, trained for war beneath the earth, no longer knew how to rest. One elderly miner in West Virginia put it plainly, "I think I forgot how to sleep honest. I still keep one ear open, waiting for something." Sleep had become a vigilance, a survival instinct that refused to go dormant. Epilogue: the dream that was promised. The promise of 8 hours for rest was never truly fulfilled for most miners. They fought for it, marched for it, suffered for it, but sleep remained elusive, tainted by years of neglect. And yet their struggle changed everything. It laid the groundwork for modern sleep laws in labor policy. It contributed to the recognition of sleep as medical, not moral. It showed that even the most boring human need could be radical in a world of exploitation. Coal miners taught us that fatigue is not just a feeling, it's a form of oppression, and sleep, real, unbroken, safe sleep, is a form of resistance. A final reflection. Picture again the miner's home, but this time it is 1955. The floor is level, the air is clear, the shift bell is silent. A man lies in bed, his boots off, his eyes closed, not from collapse but from habit. He is not afraid of being woken. The mine is closed, the family is safe. And for the first time in years, his dreams do not come from under the ground. And so we ask, if sleep is a right earned by labor, why does it remain so fragile for the working poor today?